This parable was presented in a literary style that we call allegory. And an allegory is a story that is highly symbolic. That is to say, everything in the story represents something else. It's just a symbol of something else that's not named or literally mentioned in the story. So in this parable, it's clear that the audience that read this gospel would understand that the landowner was a symbol for God. The vineyard itself was the land of Israel. The tenant farmers are the Jewish religious leaders. And the servants of the landowner who come to collect what was due are the Old Testament prophets whom God sent to the people and whom the people rejected and whom the people often killed and beat to death. Finally, the landowner's son, who is sent by God as a last-ditch effort to get through to the people, that son is Jesus himself. So when Jesus is telling this story, he's telling a story about himself and about how he himself has been rejected. And like the son in the story, he soon will be taken outside of the vineyard, in his case outside of the city, and killed. I would like to expand a little bit on some of the meanings and symbolism in the text as we consider how this story applies to us and to our lives. Because I believe that we 21st century Christians are tending the vineyard. We're the modern day, the present day people tending the vineyard. The vineyard clearly is not just the people of the land of Israel. The vineyard that we're tilling has several different parts to it, but especially as Christians, we are called to till in the vineyard, to tend the vineyard called the church. Just like those tenants, those tenant farmers, we are responsible for this land that we are tending. We're responsible for the vineyard. So, I don't know about you, but I've been a tenant once or twice in my life. And I suspect most of you have at some time rented a place to live for a period of time. Others of you may have rental property that you own and rent out. Well, I have learned one or two things about how to be a good tenant that I would like to share with you for just a minute. And I think that these are things that come out of this story. And that have everything to do with what God would have us to do. Number one, to be a good tenant, you need to pay your rent on time. Most of us take that for granted. But there's some folk who don't. But in this story, Jesus is very concerned that people are fruitful. Before this story, Jesus was walking along in the street. and he saw a fig tree that was not bearing fruit. And because it was not bearing fruit, he condemned that, he cursed that fig tree, and it withered and died. And so you see there's a connection here he's making about the importance of being fruitful. As a church, we're called to be fruitful in this community, to bear witness to Jesus, to do acts of kindness and love. That's how Christians bear fruit. We don't produce grapes like these tenant farmers were out there doing, but we produce people who go out and help other people in the community. We produce worship services that call people in together to meet God and meet with each other. We put together special programs for children that have the potential to change their lives. We reach out to the homeless community with new programs. And we have a new program that we've been talking about that we want to get off the ground called Welcome Home. That's going to give us a concrete opportunity to reach out to that community. These are some of the ways that we are able to produce fruit. And then sometimes it's not just doing a program or a ministry, but it's who you are and how you interact with other people. Just being friendly to people is good fruit. Just having a kind word to say to somebody who may need to hear a good word is producing some good fruit. Fruitfulness is important. And all of us have to bear fruit if we are to please God. So pay your rent on time. Pay your rent on time. A lot of people, these guys in the story didn't really want to pay their rent. They had rented this vineyard, signed a contract, if you will, to live on the farm, to cultivate it, to raise the crops, and the deal was that they would pay the landlord with produce that they raised. But when the harvest time came around, the landlord sent his slaves, that is his servants, to get the produce, to get the crops that they had raised, because that was the deal. But you saw in the story what happened. These evil men, these evil tenants took the servants of the landowner and they beat up the first one. The second one, they killed him. And the third one, well, they tried to stone him to death, but he got away. And that must have been the one that got back, and he and the other beaten up servant told the landowner what had happened. Now, why would they do that? Why would these tenants, having agreed to the terms of the contract, why would they turn so violently against the representatives of the landowner? Well, I think the answer is pretty plain. It's a 5-letter word, Greed. It's what happens to us sometimes, when what God has given us is not enough for us, and we feel like we have to have all of it. That's what got to them. It was just greed. I can just imagine the conversation that went on when these tenants looked up and saw the representatives from the landowner coming down the road. I'm sure that they got together their plan and what their response was going to be. The farmers probably considered various options. I suppose somebody must have said, well, we can tell him that the expenses on the farm were so great that it ate up all of the profits and there's nothing left to send to you. But somebody else probably said, no, that's not going to work, because they're in there right now going over the books. And they can see that we've had a banner year. Profits were high, expenses were within budget, the barns are bulging with the biggest crop we've ever had. We all look healthy and well-nourished, and we're all living well. We all have nice homes. Some of us have vacation homes. No, I don't believe that we can convince them that the vineyard didn't do well, that it didn't produce well this year. Now, suppose another might have said, well, maybe we could just send them a few baskets of grapes and just say, that the crop was poor. We didn't have a very large crop this year. No, that won't work, because the servants of the landowner can see the grapes, how large and delicious they are. And not only that, but the servants have already looked around the farm and seen that our barns are filled to capacity. The vats are overflowing. The wine press is working overtime, 3 shifts a day, 24/7, to turn the product around to get it to market. We can't say that the crop was not good this year. As good as God is to us, some of us just sit around and think about how little we can get away with giving back to God. We make excuses of all kinds. We tell ourselves all kinds of lies about why we cannot tithe, why we can't make a pledge for the work of the church, even though God has fixed it so that your barns are full. The food pantry in your kitchen is so full of food that you don't know yourself half of what you've got in there. Your refrigerator is so crammed full, you have to open it, if you like it is at our house, you have to open the door very carefully, lest some sausage or a head of lettuce hits you on the head. I'm just trying to say that God has been good to us, not only in terms of material things, but look how God has blessed us with our families, our friends, has given us wisdom, given us guidance, has helped us over those troubled waters. God has been good to us. He's blessed the work of our hands, and in some cases, it's just by His grace and His mercy that you have done so well. It's not that you were so smart or that you worked so hard, but by His grace and mercy that you have what you have. Even in the recession, we're eating pretty good. Most of us in here look pretty healthy. And yet, once a year, when stewardship commitment time comes around, instead of shouting, "Thank you, Lord," we find ourselves crying poor. We can still buy anything we want. We can still go pretty much anywhere we want to go. But we just get cheap and stingy and downright selfish when it comes to returning some blessings to God. Listen, folks, if we're going to be cultivating these roses around here, if we're going to keep these roses blooming, it takes some finance. It takes some sacrifice. It takes some giving from all of us. These tenant farmers in the parable were selfish and unreliable. So as they deliberated on how they were going to respond to the landowner's invoice, the servants had already arrived at the farm, and they had their trucks and they had the storage containers to haul all of the owner's stuff away. And then one of the tenant farmers said, "I have a solution to the problem." What's that? He said, "Let's not give them anything." What are we going to do with the servants of the land owner? Well, possession is 9/10 of the law. And since the owner has obviously abandoned this property, I say this property is ours. And so technically, those guys are trespassing. And that gives us a right to defend our property. And so the tenant farmers grabbed the landowner's servants and beat them and stoned them. And when the landowner got the news, his response was to send more servants. But the second group came and they got treated just as badly as the first group. Greed had overcome these guys and gals. I suppose there might have been some gals in there as well. And so the second thing I learned about being a good tenant is that you got to realize that it is not your vineyard. This is not your vineyard. We are simply watching it for somebody else. And then the third thing is we need to respect the landlord. Respect the landlord. These folks didn't have any respect for the landlord or any respect for Jesus, any respect for God. And they felt like they could do whatever they wanted to do. The real problem is that they were rejecting Jesus. They were rejecting God. That's what was going on, and that is really at the heart of this story. It's about the dangers of rejecting the Lord. A lot of folks are rejecting Jesus now. All of the major denominations are in decline. But there are a lot of ways that we reject the Lord. It's not just by not coming to church. It's not by any time we mistreat someone who was made by God, we're rejecting God. So by our behavior, even though we may be churchgoers, we might be still rejecting God. As a matter of fact, the most dangerous kind of rejection is the kind that happens in church. Those of us who are committed to Jesus, when we begin to reject God, when we begin to fail to be obedient to Him, then the kingdom is in danger. Because God has trusted us to tend to the kingdom. And if we don't tend to it, who will? If we don't water the crops, who will? The final thing that I learned about being a good tenant is that you should always leave the place better than you found it. That's kind of always been my personal ethic. Arthur and I rented a house in Los Angeles when we first came out here from Tennessee. And I was serving a church there for 2 years. And then when I was moved out to San Bernardino, we cleaned up the rental house. And, as I said, I believe in leaving a place better than you found it, but my wife is positively OCD about it. I mean, she's obsessive. And when she got to the point of, say, let's mop the floor in the closet, I said, darling. But there we were. All day, we'd packed up everything. The truck was already in San Bernardino with all our stuff on it. But far into the night, we made sure that there was not a speck of a spot of a dust anywhere in that house. It looked better than it did when we moved in. And even though I thought it was a little obsessive, some of the cleaning, I must say I was pleased that I was able to leave that kind of record. Because I believe in every relationship we go into, we have a chance to leave folk a little bit better than when they met us. I know I'm not going to be in this church for very long. I mean, I hope I'm here for at least another 10 years, but that's up to powers beyond me. But there will come a day when all of us have to leave here. And the question we will have to ask ourselves is, did we leave the church better than when we came to it? Did we use our little bit of influence with people to touch them so that their lives are better? There are folk here, I got to tell you, they do work that you'd never know is being done, all in the nooks and crannies of Del Rosa, working. You may not know about it, God knows about it. And in the long run, this beautiful campus stands because of the selfless work and giving of so many people. Because they want to leave the place better than they found it. What better thing to do? How better to be used by God than to say, I'm just going to make it my mission to leave Del Rosa better in some way than I found it. That's what Jesus did. After Jesus told this story to the Pharisees and the religious leaders, he asked them, what do you think happened? What do you think happened when the owner of that property came back after they had killed his servants and even killed his son? Those Pharisees said, well, the owner probably killed them and killed them made them have a miserable death. But they were just judging themselves because Jesus didn't even say that. Jesus surprised us. Jesus said something totally different. It might not even make sense to you when you first read the story. He said, have you not read that the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? And what did he mean by that? He meant that in this world, there is disorder. In this world, there's violence. There is a cycle of violence. Everything is messed up in this world, but I have come to be the cornerstone of a new way of living, not based on revenge and violence, but setting things straight, setting things the way they ought to be. And I, he said, am the cornerstone that this building will sit on. Jesus came back preaching love and reconciliation, not getting even for what they were going to do to him and what they had done to the prophets. Jesus came to leave this world a much better place. And that is our mission as well, as good tenants tending in the Lord's vineyard.